The energy inside the lecture hall at Pacific Heights University was electric. Nearly 400 students buzzed with anticipation as they waited for the day's lecture to begin. Professor Eleanor Kane, 48, adjusted the sleeves of her dark blazer and scanned the rows of eager young faces. Her class, Data, Democracy, and Power, had recently gained a cult following, thanks in part to her sharp takedowns of high-profile public figures and her unfiltered opinions on privilege in politics. She walked confidently toward the podium, heels clicking against the hardwood floor, and pulled up the first slide on the projector. The screen lit up with an image of Karoline Leavitt, smiling at a White House podium, blonde hair perfectly styled, eyes bright with ambition. This, Eleanor began, is the youngest White House press secretary in American history. 27 years old, smart, polished, connected. But the real question is, how much of that is substance, and how much is spin? The students murmured, some leaning forward with interest, others exchanging smirks. Eleanor turned from the screen and moved toward the whiteboard, her marker already uncapped. Karoline pushes policies and shapes narratives, but I seriously doubt she can understand the math behind the voter model she talks about on TV. Let's test that theory. With a flurry of strokes, she filled the board with a dense voter prediction model, complete with layered integrals, conditional probabilities, turnout shifts, and real-time sentiment decay variables. It looked more like a NASA launch equation than something related to politics. This, Eleanor said, pointing to the board, is what real policy forecasting looks like. Not speeches, not sound bites, just data. Math like this is what determines who wins states like Wisconsin or Pennsylvania. This is beyond someone who just reads talking points. The room fell quiet as students examined the complexity of the problem. Eleanor capped the marker and stepped back, arms crossed. Now, who wants to take a stab at solving this? Or are we ready to agree that people like Karoline are just polished faces for other people's ideas? The silence was sharp. A few students laughed awkwardly. One guy near the front wore a Trump 2024 hoodie and muttered something under his breath, but no one moved. Even the math majors looked like they wanted to melt into their seats. Eleanor tilted her head, pleased with the hesitation. She'd made her point. "No one?" she said, voice crisp. "Thought so." In the back of the hall, near the exit doors, a woman in a slate-gray cap and plain sweatshirt watched quietly. Her arms were folded, her posture relaxed, but her eyes were sharp, focused not on the screen but on Eleanor's movements. She wore rimless glasses and her auburn hair was tucked neatly beneath the cap. Most students hadn't noticed her slip in. She looked older than the crowd, maybe early 30s, but dressed down enough to blend in. She had no intention of speaking, not yet. But then Eleanor's next slide popped up, a zoomed-in clip of Karoline speaking to reporters, voice passionate, hands moving to emphasize her points. She's young, photogenic, well-connected, the perfect avatar for a White House trying to win Gen Z approval. But when it comes to voter modeling, policy mapping, and predictive trends, her team outsources that work. People like her don't solve equations, they memorize them. Some students nodded, others looked around, unsure. In the front row, the guy in the Trump hoodie frowned, clearly annoyed. A girl beside him whispered something and laughed, and then, from the back of the room, a voice rose. "Excuse me, I'd like to try." Eleanor paused, caught off guard. The students turned in unison toward the back. The woman in the cap stood, lowering it slightly over her eyes. "What's your name?" Eleanor asked, folding her arms. "Just Kay," she said. "Kay?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow, smirking slightly. "All right, Kay, if you're brave enough, come solve it." Kay moved down the aisle slowly, calmly, like she was walking into a meeting rather than a showdown. She took the marker from Eleanor's hand, glanced once at the board, and began writing. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. Her strokes were clean, deliberate. One by one, she broke down Eleanor's model, isolating variables, redefining weight parameters, accounting for real-time voter sentiment shifts. It was surgical. The room had gone pin-drop silent, save for the squeak of the marker and the occasional gasp from stunned students. The guy in the Trump hoodie leaned forward, eyes wide. After 4 full minutes, Kay stepped back and set the marker on the tray. Done. Eleanor walked to the board, her expression unreadable. She scanned the equations, moving slowly, lips pressed into a thin line. As she read, her color shifted. A flicker of disbelief crossed her face, then something quieter. Respect, maybe, or shock. Who are you? She asked. Kay smiled and removed her cap. Karoline Leavitt. A collective gasp surged through the hall. Students exploded, some in disbelief, others scrambling for their phones. Voices overlapped, questions flew across the room. One girl whispered, "No way that's her." Another said, "I saw her on Fox last night. That's really her." Eleanor stepped back as if she'd been struck. "You're Karoline Leavitt?" She blinked. "What are you doing in my class?" Caroline's voice was calm. "I saw a post about today's lecture. A few of your students were talking about how you plan to use me as an example of political privilege. I figured, why not come see it for myself?" Eleanor opened her mouth, then closed it. She was clearly struggling to find the right tone. "And you just solved that? No notes, no calculator, nothing?" Caroline shrugged slightly. "When you spend your early 20s working campaign comms, you learn fast. I had to understand how data shapes messaging. I taught myself math at night while writing speeches and crunching turnout numbers. It's not as hard as it looks, if you care enough to learn." The class erupted again. Some applauded. A few students looked at Eleanor with raised eyebrows. Eleanor finally straightened her shoulders and spoke. "You're saying you taught yourself all of this?" "Yes, while working double shifts in DC and handling reporters who assumed I only got my job because of how I look. Numbers don't lie, words do. That's why I like math." The statement hit hard. Eleanor took a breath, clearly rattled. She tried to steady her voice. "Even if you're good at this, your career still benefited from connections most people don't get." Caroline's gaze sharpened. "You teach at an elite university. You've got tenure, a PhD, an audience that listens. Isn't that privilege too?" Eleanor flinched, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. "Privilege can open doors," Caroline continued, "but walking through them, that's on you." The crowd murmured, a mix of admiration and surprise. Someone clapped slowly. Then others joined. Eleanor looked around, overwhelmed by the shift in the room. The student who'd once been the subject of her criticism now held the respect of her entire class. "You're clearly better at math than I gave you credit for," Eleanor admitted, voice lower. "But what I still don't get is why you came here. You could have ignored this." Caroline smiled, this time with a touch of Gen Z playfulness. "I came to prove I'm not just a mic and a message. I solve problems for a living. Thought I'd do it one more time, just for fun." Another cheer erupted. A few students shouted, "She's so badass." Others began posting on TikTok, already editing clips from the whiteboard challenge. Eleanor nodded, the edges of a smile forming despite herself. "You proved your point, but maybe next time I'll give you a tougher problem." Caroline tilted her head. "Sounds fun, Professor. Just make sure it's worth the drive." They both stood in front of the board, now covered with clean, optimized equations. One woman skeptical of a rising star, the other ready to dismantle every doubt thrown her way. And behind them, 400 students who would never forget the day the press secretary solved the impossible. If this video made you stay, why not give it a thumbs up? Everything about the room had shifted. Where there was once casual indifference, now there was weight. 400 students who had come to observe a lecture were suddenly witnesses to a reckoning. Karoline Leavitt, the same young woman they'd seen handling media storms at the White House, had not only stepped into a college classroom unannounced, she'd taken on an Ivy League-trained professor and walked away with the room in her hands. Professor Eleanor Kane was still processing what had just happened. Her eyes darted across the whiteboard, no, Caroline's whiteboard now, where line after line of statistical equations had been broken down, reassembled, and optimized. Eleanor had written the original problem to be unsolvable without advanced modeling tools, yet here it was, solved by someone she'd publicly dismissed as a pretty mouthpiece. The applause had died down, but the tension still hung in the air. Eleanor squared her shoulders, her voice carefully composed. "All right, Miss Leavitt, you solved it. But now explain it. Not just what you did, but why. Show us it wasn't a fluke." Caroline gave a slow nod. She wasn't rattled. If anything, she looked more focused. Calm and measured, she picked up the marker again and walked back to the whiteboard. "Let's start here," she said, pointing to the second equation Eleanor had originally written. "Your model used historical turnout by district and weighted it by fixed demographics. But there's a flaw in that. It doesn't account for real-time mood shifts. Things like economic anxiety, disinformation spikes, or even cultural events. All those affect sentiment, and sentiment shifts turnout." She drew a symbol and labeled it LS for live sentiment shift. "So I introduced a dynamic variable to represent sentiment volatility within a 7-day window before an election. It's like catching wind right before the storm breaks." The students leaned in, eyes glued to the board. Even the math majors, who'd assumed this whole thing would be a political stunt, were nodding now. Caroline continued, circling the portion of the integral Eleanor had set up for regional impact. "Then here I clustered the data differently. Instead of separating by state or party, I grouped it by behavioral archetypes: first-time voters, irregular voters, consistent voters. It makes modeling turnout curves easier, especially with limited polling data." Eleanor was still, arms crossed, eyes locked on the math, trying to poke holes in it, trying to find the gap she'd assumed would be there. "You also assigned high weight to traditional advertising," Caroline added with a raised brow. "But based on campaign data I helped analyze during the 2024 cycle, traditional TV ads don't move the needle like they used to. I lowered the weight by 60% and redistributed it to micro-targeted digital impressions and peer-to-peer texting campaigns." She stepped back, the equations now forming a complete loop. Everything was annotated, simplified, justified. And with all of that, I recalculated the model error. Your version had a plus or minus 9% margin in the swing districts. Mine cuts that to 7.2%. That's over 1 million votes in a close race. Dead silence. Then the guy in the Trump hoodie burst out laughing, slapping his desk. "She just cut the professor's error rate by 2%. That's insane." Eleanor stepped forward, eyes narrowed, but her tone had changed, less defensive, more curious. "How did you even know how to structure something like this?" Caroline turned to face her directly. "I had to learn. When I started working in communications, the biggest challenge wasn't messaging, it was prediction. You can't build a strategy if you don't understand voter behavior. So, I dug in, learned linear regression, then came multivariate forecasting, then modeling software. I downloaded public datasets, read campaign white papers, reverse-engineered algorithms." She smiled faintly. "No one gave me a playbook. I built it while I played." Another murmur rippled through the crowd. One student in the back whispered, "She built her own model. That's not just smart, that's lethal." Eleanor wasn't smiling, but she also wasn't resisting anymore. "You didn't major in math, number political science and journalism, but the numbers didn't care what my degree said. They just wanted to be understood." Eleanor turned back to the board. Every line Caroline had written was tight, coherent, strategic, not just a correct solution, but a better one. It stung, not because she'd been beaten, but because she'd misjudged someone who clearly didn't fit the lazy stereotype she'd assigned. "I underestimated you," Eleanor said finally, her voice quieter than before. Caroline tilted her head, her voice even. "Most people do, especially when I wear makeup and smile while doing it." More phones came up. Someone was live streaming now. Eleanor noticed and raised her hand for quiet. "Hold on." Before you all turn this into a viral clip, let's actually have a conversation. She turned to Caroline again. Fine. You beat me at my own problem. But why now? Why this class? You could have let this slide. Caroline looked around the room, then back at Eleanor. You want the honest answer? Always. Caroline folded her arms. Because I'm tired of people treating me like a TikTok mascot for the GOP. I've worked on strategy, policy alignment, data tracking. I've sat in 5-hour meetings about bill logistics and spent nights in hotel rooms debugging voter outreach software. But that doesn't trend. What trends is the hair, the podium, the snappy clapbacks. I came here to remind myself that I'm still more than the headlines. The room fell silent again, this time with something closer to admiration. The only way to be taken seriously is to show receipts, so here I am. Eleanor nodded slowly. You made your point. Before Caroline could respond, someone near the middle row raised a hand. I have a question. They both turned. How did you even know this class was happening? Did someone invite you? Caroline hesitated for the first time. Not exactly. I was browsing social media this morning, checking for press reactions to last night's White House briefing, and I saw a post from a student here. Something like, Professor Kane's finally going to expose Karoline Leavitt. I figured why not drop in? You just happened to be in California. Press conference in Oakland tomorrow. I was already here. Another hand went up, a girl in a Cal hoodie. But how did you solve it so fast? This isn't something you just see on Instagram. I didn't. I saw the structure and realized it was similar to some of the modeling we did during the 2024 campaign. Same variables, same friction points, just wrapped differently. That's when something shifted in Eleanor's expression. Not skepticism, but caution. She pointed toward the board. That model, it's not published. I built it myself, modified it over the last 2 months for this class. No one should have seen it. Caroline's brow furrowed. You think I cheated? Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She scanned the room. Someone posted about this class. Someone mentioned your name. And somehow, you walked in with a solution already forming in your head. Caroline took a step forward, firm but composed. I don't cheat. Ever. I don't need to. If I saw a problem similar to what I've modeled before, that's not theft. That's experience. Still, Eleanor said, eyes narrowing, the timing's odd. The publicity, the recording, the whispers. Before they could dig deeper, a student rushed forward, phone in hand. Professor, look at this. He showed her a post from a new anonymous account. The caption read, Karoline Leavitt just solved Dr. Kane's impossible problem, live. Caught her cold, didn't see it coming. Posted 3 minutes ago. Eleanor's voice dropped. Whoever wrote this, they knew what would happen. Caroline leaned in, her expression turning serious. Someone wanted me here, not just to test me, to watch. A chill swept across the lecture hall. Caroline turned to Eleanor. And they're not done watching. Eleanor's lips pressed into a line. She didn't know what this was turning into, but it was no longer just about math. Something deeper was unfolding. The game had changed, and now they were both in it. The lecture hall hadn't quite recovered. Students were still murmuring, eyes darting to their phones, thumbs scrolling frantically to see who else had seen the post. The anonymous update that went live mid-lecture, the one that described Caroline's arrival, her solution, and Eleanor's stunned reaction, wasn't just accurate, it was impossibly timely. Karoline Leavitt stood at the base of the whiteboard, arms folded, still facing Professor Eleanor Kane. Her calm was beginning to fray around the edges, not from doubt in her own abilities, but from something deeper, something less rational. Someone knew she was coming. Someone had planned for it. Eleanor walked over slowly, holding the student's phone, reading the post again. The account was brand new. No name, no profile picture, no followers. Just a timestamp and an unnerving amount of precision. You sure you didn't tell anyone you were coming? She asked. Caroline shook her head. Absolutely not. I only decided this morning, saw a few student posts on social saying you were planning to call me out. Figured I'd check it out on my own. You drove here? From Oakland. Wasn't far. I put on the cap so I wouldn't cause a scene. Eleanor nodded slowly, still not quite satisfied. But this post went live 3 minutes ago. Describes the problem, says you solved it. No one could have written that from memory unless they were here. Watching. Caroline stepped closer, lowering her voice. Or listening. They both turned to scan the room. The students, many still glued to their screens, seemed oblivious to the shift in atmosphere. But Caroline's instincts, sharpened by years of political theater, told her something wasn't right. She leaned in. Have you ever had someone try to sabotage you? Eleanor let out a dry laugh, though it lacked any real humor. I'm a tenured woman in a male-dominated math department. You tell me. Caroline didn't smile. Then who, she asked, might want to make you look careless or worse? Eleanor looked thoughtful, then suddenly still. Victor Hammond. Caroline raised an eyebrow. Friend of yours? Colleague, former department chair. Thinks I'm ruining mathematics by bringing social impact into my lectures. Told me last year I was turning calculus into a TED Talk. We haven't exactly had coffee since. He have access to your files. Server privileges, yes, but everything sensitive is encrypted. Except this problem wasn't public, Caroline said slowly, and yet someone expected me to show up and solve it while they sat back and watched, which means they either wanted to discredit me, or you, or both, Eleanor added. Caroline's phone buzzed. She glanced down. Another post from the same anonymous account. Kane just froze after Leavitt dropped her final line, "This is better than CS-PAN." The post included a clip, low quality but clearly filmed from the back of the hall. The angle suggested someone had held up their phone discreetly, long enough to capture the ending. They're here, Caroline said flatly, in this room. Now Eleanor's eyes swept over the rows of students. We need to talk somewhere else. She turned to the class, voice authoritative. All right, class is dismissed for today. I want everyone to head out quietly. No more recording. This session is over. The students slowly packed up, still buzzing with energy. A few lingered in the aisles, hesitant to leave the drama behind. But Eleanor didn't soften. She stood firm until the room was empty. Once the door clicked shut, she motioned for Caroline to follow her out a side exit. They walked briskly across campus, past wind-blown sycamore trees and low concrete buildings. Students passed by in pairs and clusters, laughing, chattering, oblivious to the undercurrent running beneath the afternoon sun. Eleanor unlocked her office on the 3rd floor of the science building. Inside, the space was small and cluttered, books stacked on every surface, whiteboards full of scribbles, a coffee maker buzzing faintly in the corner. She shut the door and locked it behind them. No one else has the key to this office, she said. Caroline took a seat opposite the desk, scanning the room. If Hammond accessed your server recently, he might have seen a draft of your model, enough to reconstruct today's problem. Maybe he figured if I showed up and embarrassed you, it would undermine your credibility, or if you embarrassed me, even better. Eleanor nodded slowly. Except I didn't tell anyone I'd use that model today. The only time I mentioned it was 2 months ago, in a department meeting. Caroline's gaze sharpened. Was Hammond there? Yes. And did he ask you anything about it afterward? He did. Wanted to see the draft. Said he was curious. I told him it wasn't finalized. He pushed, but I shut it down. Caroline leaned back, her expression darkening. So he knew it existed, had motive, had access. Maybe he even figured if the problem went viral, he could pass off your modeling framework as his own. Eleanor opened her laptop and began typing furiously. Let's see if he accessed my files recently. She pulled up the department server log. After a few clicks, she stopped. Here, last week. Hammond's credentials were used to access my private folder, same one I stored the draft in. Caroline stood up, pacing now. He didn't need the finished version, just enough to reconstruct it. Then he leaks word that I'll be publicly embarrassed. He counts on me showing up. Either I fall flat or you do, and he profits from the fallout. Eleanor looked up. Profits how? Caroline stopped, her tone measured. Because models like yours, if refined, are political gold. Firms in D.C. pay millions for voter prediction tools with even a slight edge. A model that claims 95% accuracy with media and turnout predictors? That's an asset. One he could quietly sell if no one knew it was stolen. Eleanor stood, her face pale. I can't believe it. He's my colleague. Caroline didn't blink. I've worked with enough operatives to know people don't sell loyalty. They sell leverage. They both stood in silence. The weight of what they were suggesting was heavy, but Caroline was already moving. We can't prove anything yet, not with server logs alone. He'll just say it was departmental oversight. Then what do we do? Eleanor asked. Caroline smiled, sharp and deliberate. We bait him. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. How? We give him something to steal, something he can't resist. Eleanor crossed her arms. A fake model? Caroline nodded. But it has to look real. You write the skeleton. I'll layer in some White House-style spin, charts, real-world data, just enough to make it feel polished. And then? We track it. Build a hidden watermark into the file. My assistant back in D.C. can help. If he opens it or sends it, we'll know. And if he tries to sell it? Caroline's smile widened. Then we'll be right behind him. Eleanor still looked unconvinced. What if it doesn't work? It will. I've set bigger traps in D.C. for people with sharper teeth. This guy's just a professor with an ego. He wants attention, and he wants money. That makes him predictable. Eleanor slowly nodded. Okay, let's write ourselves a trap. They both sat at the cluttered desk. Books were pushed aside, laptops powered on. Eleanor began building a fresh document, Project Referendum, filled with complex-looking math and voter modeling code. Caroline added context, data points from past elections, and graphs that would pass a surface-level analysis. Within an hour, the file looked legitimate. Too legitimate. Eleanor paused, staring at it. This is almost convincing enough to use for real. Caroline smiled. That's the point. We want him to think he's struck gold. Eleanor saved the file and reached into her drawer for an old flash drive. Let's upload it here. Caroline pulled out her phone, dialing quickly. Jen? Hey, need a favor? Can you embed a silent tracker into a doc? Yeah, full trace, email, GPS, anything. Sending it now. She hung up and turned to Eleanor. We'll have eyes on wherever this goes. If Hammond takes the bait, we follow. If he sells it, we record it. And then? Caroline leaned back, eyes gleaming. We make sure he's not the only one who goes viral. Professor Eleanor Kane's office, once just a cramped corner in Pacific Heights University's math department, now felt like the command center of something much larger. Gone were the casual days of whiteboard lectures and coffee-scented mornings. Now her desktop was a battleground, open tabs on data encryption, political consulting firms, and file tracking software flickering under fluorescent lights. Across from her, Karoline Leavitt was already deep in motion, scrolling through messages from her White House assistant, Jen. A short, sharp woman who once handled internal media vetting for the West Wing, Jen had agreed, without hesitation, to help implement a hidden digital signature inside the file they were crafting. The tracker would be invisible but deadly, pinging every IP address, email relay, and GPS location the file touched. Eleanor stared at the final version of the bait document. At the top, Project Referendum, a predictive voter behavior model with 95% accuracy. It looked good, too good. She ran a hand through her hair, still struggling to believe she'd just built a fake version of the most advanced model she'd ever designed. If this were real, she murmured, it could win elections. Caroline looked up. Her tone didn't shift. That's why we're making it look like it is. The document was slick. It featured layers of elegant equations, simulated outputs, even references to predictive trends in mid-size swing states. Karoline had added graphs pulled from real campaign data she'd worked on during the 2024 cycle, customized enough to seem authentic, generic enough to avoid triggering alarms. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. All right, the model's done. But how do we get Hammond to bite? Karoline's eyes gleamed. Easy. You invite him over. You want me to just hand it to him. You dangle it. Tell him we had a breakthrough, that I helped you refine the model. Throw in a little urgency. Say it's too sensitive to email. He'll come running. Eleanor exhaled through her nose. Hammond wasn't stupid, but he was greedy. I've seen this type before, Karoline said, crossing one leg over the other. In DC, they show up with smiles and leave with your ideas in their pocket, but they always underestimate the people who hand them the flash drive. Eleanor reached into her drawer, pulling out a metallic USB stick. This old thing's been sitting here since 2018. Let's make it famous. Karoline smiled. I'll send Jen the final version. She'll inject the tracker and let us know the second Hammond tries anything. They loaded the file onto the drive. Within minutes, Jen confirmed the tracker was live. It would record everything, when it opened, where, on what device, even any forwarding attempts. At 2:41 p.m., Eleanor drafted a short email. Victor just finished a new predictive model with Karoline Leavitt. 95% accuracy. Need to discuss. Confidential. Meet me in my office at 3. She hit send. Her stomach tightened. Karoline stood, glancing toward the door. You ready for this? Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. Ready enough. The knock came precisely at 3 p.m. Eleanor opened the door to find Professor Victor Hammond standing tall in his signature tweed jacket, dark-rimmed glasses perched neatly on the bridge of his nose. His expression was polite, charming even, but Eleanor could feel the ambition under his skin. Hammond didn't hide it well, not when opportunity was close. Victor, Eleanor said, gesturing him in. Inside, Karoline stood by the window, flipping through a stack of blank documents to maintain the illusion of work. She looked up with the perfect amount of detached professionalism. Ah, Miss Leavitt, Hammond said with a tight smile. A surprise. Pleasure, Karoline replied evenly. I was just helping Eleanor interpret some of the model's real-world implications. Hammond sat across from the desk and folded his hands neatly. So, 95% accuracy, you say? Eleanor clicked to open the bait file on her laptop and rotated the screen toward him. We merged my existing turnout algorithm with Karoline's media behavior dataset, optimized for real-time voter swing predictions. It's not peer-reviewed yet, obviously. Still raw. Hammond's eyes scanned the page, then the charts. His smile grew. This is something. This could actually work in the field. Karoline leaned forward slightly. It already has. Some of the features echo tools we used in 2024, targeted states, last-minute messaging shifts, but this is more refined, smarter. And no one else has seen this? Eleanor shook her head. Not even the department. Hammond looked up, voice low. What if I told you I knew people who would pay for something like this? Karoline didn't blink. We'd say we're listening. Eleanor kept her posture neutral. We're not selling anything yet, Victor. It's early, unproven. That never stopped clients before, he said with a grin. He reached out as Eleanor slowly pulled open the drawer and handed him the USB. Just for review, she said. Keep it close, no distribution. Of course, he said, slipping it into his jacket pocket like it was a check for $1 million. He stood to leave, shaking both their hands with professional warmth. When the door clicked shut, Eleanor turned to Karoline. You think he bought it? Karoline pulled out her phone. We're about to find out. They didn't have to wait long. At 3:38 p.m., Karoline's phone buzzed. It was Jen. He opened the file. Karoline nodded to Eleanor. He took the bait. Jen was still speaking, fast and precise. The file was sent via email to an encrypted address. No name. But the tracker pinged a server in DC, Stratton Analytics. Eleanor's eyebrows shot up. I've heard of them. They consult for major campaigns. Private, high-paying, ruthless. Karoline nodded. They tried to buy data from us in 2024. My team refused. They've been circling ever since. Another buzz. Jen again. The file was opened 5 minutes after it was sent. The IP matches Stratton's internal server. No doubt. They're testing it. Eleanor sat back, stunned. He really did it. Karoline's eyes hardened. And we've got proof. Not just access logs. We know where and when. That's enough to make the case, if we get one last piece. What piece? Face-to-face confirmation. Eleanor tensed. You want to record him meeting them. Exactly. Emails can be denied, logs can be spun, but if we get audio of him offering the file, talking payment, that's airtight. Jen's voice came through again. Hold on, just found Hammond's calendar. He's got a meeting with someone labeled MR at 7 p.m. tonight. Bean and Brew, the cafe off campus. That's Stratton's local guy, Mark Reynolds. Eleanor and Karoline locked eyes. That's our moment, Karoline said. We stake out the cafe, get the recording. After that, he's finished. You sure we can pull this off? Karoline's smile returned, sharp, almost playful. I've slipped past national press in 5-inch heels. This question mark. This is just coffee. Eleanor grabbed her coat, the adrenaline finally setting in. Then let's go catch ourselves a thief. At 6:45 p.m., the sun dipped low behind the trees as the two women stepped into the quiet hum of Bean and Brew. The cafe was dimly lit, with hanging bulbs casting warm light over wooden tables. A few grad students lounged in the corners. Eleanor and Karoline chose a table near the window, half hidden by a bookshelf. Karoline adjusted her cap again, low over her eyes. Eleanor wore oversized sunglasses she hadn't used in years. At exactly 7 p.m., Victor Hammond entered, briefcase in hand. He scanned the cafe, spotted the man in the gray suit sitting near the front, and approached. The two shook hands. Karoline tapped record on her phone, sliding it beneath a napkin. Eleanor leaned in, barely breathing. This is Project Referendum, Hammond said. Martinez's model, enhanced by Leavitt. 95% accuracy. No one else has seen it. The man, Mark Reynolds, nodded, taking the USB. If this works, Stratton pays $2 million, but we need to test it. Can you guarantee it's clean? Hammond chuckled. Martinez encrypted her drafts like an amateur. And Leavitt, she's just a mouthpiece. They'll never see this coming. Eleanor's jaw tightened. Karoline placed a hand on her arm, signaling restraint. We've got what we need, she whispered. Now we bury him. The moment Victor Hammond left the cafe, briefcase under his arm and ego high in the clouds, Karoline and Eleanor stayed seated. No sudden moves, no glances exchanged. Just two women sipping lukewarm coffee, waiting for the storm to settle behind him. Karoline tapped her phone once and whispered, It's all there, full audio, clean as a whistle. Eleanor exhaled for the first time in 5 minutes. He really did it. Sold your fake model, our model. He didn't even blink, Karoline said, her voice low and calm. He practically handed Stratton Analytics a golden goose and bragged about it. Eleanor watched the cafe door swing shut behind him. What happens now? Karoline stood, slipping the phone into her jacket pocket. Now we make this public. The next morning, the auditorium at Pacific Heights University was packed wall to wall. It wasn't a class day. It wasn't even a scheduled lecture. But the whispers had spread. Something big was coming. Professors, students, local press. Even a few alumni had slipped in, sensing drama brewing under the academic surface. Victor Hammond stood at the podium, straightening his tie. The banner behind him read, Annual Science and Society Symposium, Reclaiming the Power of Mathematics. Of course it would be that title. He launched into his keynote without hesitation, his voice smooth as butter, his hands gesturing toward a projected chart that looked suspiciously close to Project Referendum. And this, he said, pointing to a bar graph, is what true mathematical integrity can do. Restore faith in our democratic systems through unbiased, data-driven modeling. In the back row, Caroline crossed one leg over the other and nudged Eleanor. Showtime. Eleanor stood and raised her hand. Professor Hammond, she called. A question? The entire room turned. Hammond faltered only slightly before recovering his smile. Of course, Eleanor. What's on your mind? Eleanor walked slowly down the center aisle, each step echoing against the polished floor. I was wondering what your thoughts are on stealing a colleague's research and selling it to a political firm for profit. Gasps rippled through the audience like a shockwave. Hammond blinked. His smile dimmed. I'm sorry. What? Eleanor didn't stop. Because last night you took a model you didn't create, handed it to a consultant from Stratton Analytics, and promised them results I built. On paper I never gave you permission to see. That's ridiculous, Hammond snapped. I have no idea what you're talking about. Caroline stood now, calm and steady. Then maybe you can explain this. She walked to the front and plugged her phone into the projector. The screen lit up. Audio played, crystal clear. This is Project Referendum, Martinez's model enhanced by Leavitt, 95% accuracy. Gasps turned to murmurs, then to shouts. Eleanor watched as Hammond's face lost all color. That recording's fake, he stammered. Caroline didn't blink. Then explain the digital tracker embedded in the USB you took. She held up a printed report, courtesy of Jen. It shows the exact moment the file was opened, the email it was sent to, and the Stratton server that received it. Timestamped, geolocated, unmistakable. You didn't just steal our work, she continued. You tried to sell it, and you underestimated us. By now, the university's provost and 2 department chairs had moved toward the front. The audience had gone silent again, waiting for the final nail. Eleanor spoke, voice strong. Victor Hammond, your server log shows unauthorized access to my private research folder. You violated university policy, academic integrity standards, and basic ethics. The department chair stepped forward, eyes cold. You're suspended immediately. There will be a full investigation and we will involve legal counsel. Hammond tried to speak, but nothing came out. He turned, saw the audience, half filming, half shaking their heads, and knew it was over. 2 security officers approached from the side and quietly escorted him out. Eleanor and Caroline remained at the front. It was done. Later that afternoon, back in Eleanor's office, the energy had shifted again, but this time with a quiet satisfaction. The trap had worked. The recording had made its rounds. Students were uploading clips on every platform with captions like, "She outplayed the professor with his own math," and "Karoline Leavitt, not just a mic." Even faculty from other departments were dropping by with stunned congratulations. Caroline scrolled through her phone. We're trending. Eleanor looked up from her laptop. What are they saying? That we're the most unlikely academic duo of the year. Someone called it Blonde Heat meets Cold Calculus. Caroline laughed. Okay, I like that one. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. We just pulled off a sting operation worthy of the FBI over a math model. Caroline held up a finger. Over your math model. And a system that's too used to people like Hammond getting away with it. They both grew quiet for a moment. Then Eleanor looked at the document still open on her screen, the real version of the model, the one they'd sidelined while designing the bait. You know, she said, this one, it actually could work. Caroline nodded. I was thinking the same thing. We already tested the public-facing elements. If we clean it up, add real variables, and adjust for volatility, we've got something powerful. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. You serious about refining it? Caroline didn't hesitate. Yes. Let's build the real Project Referendum. Not for Stratton, not for politics, for public policy, voter transparency, educational use, open source? Absolutely. Eleanor paused, then extended her hand. Then let's do it. But this time, no traps, no sting. Just the truth. Caroline shook her hand, her voice low and certain. Deal. And the next time someone doubts us, they'll have data to answer to. The sun had just started its slow descent behind the White House when Karoline Leavitt stepped into the small press room on the west side of the building. The American flag hung crisply behind the podium, lit by warm overhead lighting and flanked by two screens that displayed a new logo in blue and white, Project Referendum, Predictive Modeling for Public Policy. To her left, Professor Eleanor Kane stood tall in a navy suit, hair pinned up, expression focused but calm. The woman who once tried to use Caroline as an example of privilege now stood beside her as a collaborator, as an equal. Camera shutters clicked the moment they entered. Reporters from CNN, Fox, The Washington Post, and independent news blogs had all crammed into the tight rows. Everyone had heard the story, how the former chair of a math department was exposed for stealing intellectual property, how a press secretary solved a complex equation in front of a packed lecture hall, how the two women turned a stage trap into a working policy tool. Caroline approached the mic, her voice steady and clear. Thank you for joining us today. We're here to announce the release of a project we never meant to start, but ended up finishing with purpose. She gestured toward the screen. This is the real Project Referendum. Not the decoy file we created to catch a thief, but a refined data-driven model designed to improve how we understand voter behavior, turnout trends, and even public trust. The camera zoomed in as the graph behind her shifted, showing turnout probabilities mapped across demographic segments tied to real-time sentiment and economic shifts. Eleanor stepped up. We tested the model using 2024 midterm data and verified its margin of error, just under 3%. That's tighter than anything I've published before. It's not just for campaigns, it's for journalists, educators, even local governments trying to understand the populations they serve. A hand shot up from the press pool. A CNN reporter stood. Miss Leavitt, after the controversy at Pacific Heights University, how can we be sure this model is really yours? Caroline didn't blink. Because we documented every step. We didn't just build the model, we exposed the person who tried to steal it. The original version was bait. This one? We coded and tested it ourselves, and if you doubt it, check the source files. We're releasing it open source. Another reporter called out. Why release it for free? You could have licensed it, made millions. Eleanor answered this time, because that's what Hammond would have done. He tried to sell a version of this to Stratton Analytics for a profit. We're not interested in fueling that kind of market. We want this to serve the public, not manipulate it. A Fox News reporter raised his hand. So this wasn't authorized by the White House. Caroline smirked, her Gen Z confidence breaking through. Nope, I did this on my own time, but I think they're cool with it now. The room laughed, light but genuine. Another voice piped up from the back. Professor Kane, you once called Miss Leavitt a product of privilege. What changed? Eleanor didn't flinch. I got to know her. I watched her outthink me, outwork me, and when someone came after both of us, she didn't run, she got smarter. That's not privilege, that's grit. Caroline glanced sideways at her, the faintest smile playing on her lips. Eleanor continued. I had to ask myself why I was so eager to doubt her in the first place. It wasn't just politics, it was perception. I saw youth and confidence and assumed it meant emptiness. I was wrong. A hush settled in the room. Reporters stopped typing for a moment, sensing something rare. Two women from opposite worlds standing not in opposition but in alignment. Caroline took the mic again. We're releasing Project Referendum on a public server this afternoon. It includes full documentation, methodology notes, and even a classroom version for universities. We want this to be usable, transparent. Let this be the start of a better conversation about data, elections, and who we trust to shape the narrative. Another round of camera flashes lit up the room. When the press conference ended, Eleanor and Caroline stepped into the hallway. Staffers passed them on either side, whispering about the model, already pulling it up on laptops. That went better than I expected, Eleanor said. You were great with the reporters, Caroline replied. Better than your whiteboard game, even. Eleanor laughed. Don't push it. They stopped near the tall windows overlooking the south lawn. Afternoon sun poured in, casting long shadows on the marble floors. You know, Caroline said, I thought this whole thing was going to be one showdown. Prove my point. Walk away. Same, Eleanor replied. Except I thought I'd be the one walking away victorious. And now, I think we've started something bigger than both of us. Caroline pulled out her phone, scrolled through the trending topics. Their names were near the top. Referendum Project, Karoline and Leavitt, Shakur Mathwins, not just a press secretary. She smirked. They're calling us the 202's most unexpected duo. Eleanor shook her head, still amazed. And to think it all started because I tried to humiliate you. Caroline glanced at her. And because someone underestimated you enough to try and steal your work. They stood in silence for a moment, then Caroline nodded. Let's make sure the next model we build is one no one sees coming. Deal, Eleanor said. And this time no disguises, no sting-ops, just good math. Well, Caroline said, maybe one disguise. I look great in that baseball cap. A few days later, the White House press briefing room was standing room only. The energy felt different, less like a political update and more like a cultural moment. Reporters leaned forward in their chairs. Cameras were already live. The back row buzzed with whispers, everyone speculating what Karoline Leavitt was about to say. The door opened and she stepped up to the podium, poised, confident, but with a spark of something deeper. Not just policy or strategy, something personal. Behind her, two screens glowed with the now familiar logo, Project Referendum. To her left, Professor Eleanor Kane stood again, this time with a polished composure that somehow still didn't mask the intensity in her eyes. Caroline adjusted the mic and began. Today's briefing is different, not about the economy, not about foreign policy. Today's about numbers, trust, and the stories they tell when no one's looking. She paused, letting the room breathe. 2 weeks ago, I sat in a lecture hall disguised as a student. I walked in thinking I'd prove a point. I walked out with a partner, a model, and a mission. Behind her, the screen changed, showing a clean, annotated snapshot of Project Referendum's refined prediction algorithm. Error margin, 2.9%. Eleanor took a step forward. We built this model to predict voter turnout with unprecedented accuracy, but it turned into something else. A lesson in how quickly we judge, how fast we underestimate, and what happens when you combine institutional theory with real-world experience. A New York Times reporter raised her hand. Professor Kane, you once challenged Miss Leavitt's qualifications publicly. How did this turn into a collaboration? Eleanor nodded slowly. By watching her outthink me, and realizing I hadn't asked the most important question, not where she came from, but what she was capable of. Caroline added smoothly, I used to believe that to be respected, I had to look like I belonged in the room. Then I realized the only way to change the room was to walk in anyway. Hands shot up, but Caroline continued. We're releasing Project Referendum under an open-source license. It's available for any school, city, nonprofit, or agency that wants to understand the dynamics of civic participation. No paywalls, no exclusivity. The screen flashed through bullet points. 95% accuracy in swing district simulations, adaptive sentiment tracking, educational toolkit for universities, real-time adjustment feature for public campaigns. A Fox News reporter leaned in. So what exactly makes this model better than the ones used by major firms? Eleanor answered. It doesn't just predict who will vote, it helps explain why. It tracks how narratives, misinformation, and policy announcements ripple across demographics. It's part math, part media literacy, Caroline added. And unlike what some firms tried to do with it, it's not for sale. CNN chimed in. Was the White House involved in creating this? Caroline smiled. This was off the clock, but they were smart enough to let us use the mic once we proved it mattered. The room broke into light laughter, then a pause. A younger journalist in the back raised her hand slowly. Miss Leavitt, what would you say to someone who doesn't think they belong in this kind of space? In politics, data, math? Caroline's face softened. I'd say the room was never built for people like me either. But I built my skills anyway. I read until midnight, taught myself calculus through campaign data, and showed up where I wasn't invited. You don't need permission to become undeniable. She looked at Eleanor, and when you do the work, someone will notice. Maybe even someone who doubted you at first. Eleanor smiled, quiet but proud. A Politico reporter raised a final question. What's next for Project Referendum? Caroline grinned. We're working on an extension model now, focused on social media polarization and its impact on youth turnout. And yes, we'll be pulling data from Gen Z trends. Apparently, you can model civic engagement with TikTok behavior. Who knew? The room chuckled again, this time more genuinely. Eleanor added, we'll also be speaking at 3 universities over the next month, explaining how we built the model and how to challenge systems with numbers instead of just noise. Caroline nodded. Truth backed by data. That's the goal. The briefing wrapped with applause, not the orchestrated kind that sometimes echoed through DC halls, but real, spontaneous claps from journalists who had just watched something rare, collaboration between opposites, for something bigger than themselves. As they stepped off the podium, Eleanor glanced sideways. Think they'll let us do a TED Talk? Caroline laughed. Only if you promise to not roast me with another integral. Deal, Eleanor said, but only if you finally admit you enjoyed the showdown. Caroline held up her hands, mock surrender. Fine, I did, even when I thought you were about to humiliate me. They stopped at the edge of the hallway, sunlight slanting through the windows. For a moment it was quiet. Outside, Washington pulsed as usual, divided, loud, spinning. But in here, 2 women stood united by math, truth, and the most unexpected kind of respect. And for once, the press didn't care what party they came from, just that they showed up and proved they belonged. Later that evening, Caroline Leavitt sat alone in the East Wing media room, lights dimmed, scrolling through a blur of posts. Project Referendum was trending across every major platform. TikToks were popping up with audio clips from her whiteboard showdown. Side-by-side memes of her and Professor Kane were everywhere, from Brain and Brawn jokes to political fan edits with captions like the Data Avengers. But it wasn't the attention that mattered. It was the shift. A college senior in Ohio had posted a video saying, I used to think math was just numbers. Now I'm seeing its power, truth, strategy. A teacher from Georgia stitched the press conference and added, finally, models not just for votes, but for values. And dozens of girls, young women, and students from underrepresented communities were tagging Hawker Solve like Caroline, sharing clips of themselves tackling equations, breaking down civic topics, or just saying, she makes me want to try. Caroline set her phone down, exhaled, then hit record on her personal message to her followers. Hey, this isn't a press statement. No suits, no teleprompters, just me. She glanced at the camera, steady, direct. A couple weeks ago, I walked into a classroom I wasn't supposed to be in to solve a problem I wasn't supposed to understand, created by a professor who didn't think I belonged. Not because she's cruel, but because we've built a system where it's normal to judge someone based on where they're from, how they look, or who they work for. She paused. I've been underestimated since the day I took the mic in the White House briefing room. People said I was too young, too polished, too lucky. But here's what they didn't see. Late nights reading voter files, learning regression analysis, decoding campaign data so I could answer not just what we were saying, but why. She leaned forward slightly. If you've ever been dismissed because of your background, your politics, your gender, your age, welcome to the club. But also, here's the truth. You can learn anything, build anything, change everything, not by shouting louder, but by showing up smarter, with data, with discipline, with receipts. She let the silence hang for a beat. The world doesn't just need louder voices, it needs earned voices. Her voice softened but grew more powerful. And if someone tells you you don't belong in the room, do what I did. Walk in anyway. Solve the damn problem. Make the math yours. A half smile curved at the corner of her mouth. I went in to prove a point. I left with a partner, a model, and maybe a little hope that in this divided country, people from different worlds can still team up when the stakes are high enough. She lifted the phone, her tone warm now, like a friend. So whether you're solving equations or just trying to make your voice heard, don't wait for permission. Start now. Build your own version of Project Referendum. And if someone ever underestimates you, let them. It makes the win taste better. She hit stop, saved it, no edits, and posted it with the caption, "No mic, no script, just data and truth. Solve like Karoline." Then she sat back in the chair, watching the video go live. Somewhere, in 1,000 classrooms, bedrooms, offices, and cafes, someone was watching, and maybe, just maybe, deciding not to wait for permission either. So if this story meant something to you, hit like, share it with someone who's been underestimated, and subscribe for more stories where truth, grit, and data collide. We're just getting started.